Revenge. The rainstorm hammered the village with fury, turning the earth beneath into a slippery, muddy expanse. Streets that were usually lined with small cottages and market stalls were now drowning in murky water, as the downpour showed no sign of letting up. The sky above was a heavy sheet of gray, and the thunder rumbled like an ominous warning. It wasn't until the floodwaters began to surge higher that the body was discovered. The man's body lay face down in the muck, lifeless and cold. The villagers, who had gathered to watch the rising waters, saw the figure floating motionlessly in the brown river of sludge that had once been their street. At first, it seemed like another victim of the storm, perhaps a traveler who had been caught in the flood, but something about it felt wrong. The man's head was severed from his body, the gruesome sight leaving the onlookers speechless. This can't be," one of the older villagers, Sarah, murmured as she stepped closer to the body. Her voice trembled with fear, her hands clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Who would do such a thing? A young boy stood beside her, staring at the body with wide eyes. His gaze flickered from the headless corpse to the water as it lapped gently at the edges of the street, like a predator waiting for its next victim. Daniel, the village's local investigator, had been summoned as soon as the discovery was made. He arrived at the scene drenched, his coat heavy from the rain, his face grim. The water soaked through his boots as he approached the body, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with a practiced gaze. He had seen death before, murders, accidents, the tragedies that struck the village every so often, but this was different. This wasn't just a death. It was a message. "Clear the area," Daniel ordered, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. His commanding tone made the villagers step back instinctively, knowing that he had taken control of the situation. The men who had been closest to the body hesitated but obeyed, stepping away and leaving Daniel with the grim discovery. He crouched down to examine the body more closely, ignoring the cold rainwater soaking his pants and the muddy streets around him. His gaze was steady as he took in the details. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious wounds to the body except for the decapitation. The severed head had not been swept away in the current, suggesting that whoever had done this had taken their time with the murder, deliberately leaving it behind to be found. "It's as if they wanted us to find him," Daniel muttered to himself, rubbing his chin. He looked up at the villagers who had gathered at a distance. "Who found him?" A man stepped forward, his face pale from the shock. "I did. I was trying to get to my shop, just wanted to see if anything was left after the flood, and then I saw him. The body, floating right there. I pulled him out and then The man's voice trailed off, the horror of what he had seen still fresh in his mind. Daniel nodded, his gaze never leaving the body. "Good work. Let's get him out of the water." Two men from the crowd stepped forward to help Daniel, carefully lifting the body onto the solid ground. As they did, Daniel noticed something strange. The man's clothing was too pristine, almost out of place in the muck that covered him. It didn't match the usual tattered or worn garments of the villagers who had been caught in the flood. The clothes looked expensive, more suited to someone from outside the village. Daniel's curiosity piqued. "Who was he?" Daniel asked, turning toward the crowd. A murmur ran through the villagers, but no one seemed to know the man. Some shook their heads in confusion, while others seemed too shaken to respond. Sarah, the older woman, stepped forward again, her brow furrowed in thought. "I've never seen him before. He's not from here. He doesn't look like any of the regulars." Daniel stood, stepping away from the body for a moment to consider. The whole scene felt wrong. The flood was bad, but this was something else. This was deliberate. The head had been removed with surgical precision. Whoever had done this had experience, maybe even a twisted, ritualistic motive. "We need to get the body back to my office," Daniel said. "I'll perform a more thorough examination. We'll find out who this is." The men who had helped lift the body nodded, and together, they carried it to the small building where Daniel worked. As they moved the corpse through the narrow, rain-soaked streets, Daniel's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why had he been decapitated? What message was the killer trying to send? And more importantly, who else was at risk? Inside his office, Daniel carefully laid the body down on a metal table. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. He began his work, his hands steady as he checked for any other injuries, any clues that might point to the killer. But there was nothing, just the severed head, so cleanly removed. Daniel's eyes narrowed. This was no accident, he muttered to himself. This was planned. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. It was Sarah, the older woman from earlier. She looked more concerned now, her face tight with worry. Is there anything you can tell us? She asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Daniel stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. Not yet. But I promise you this, Sarah. The person who did this is still out there. And they're dangerous. The room fell silent. The storm raged on outside, but inside, a sense of dread hung in the air. This wasn't just a murder. It was the start of something much darker. Daniel could feel it in his bones. The village was about to be thrust into something far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. And he was the one who would have to face it. I'll find them, he said, more to himself than to Sarah. I have to? Daniel's mind raced as he left the scene of the murder, walking through the muddy streets with his thoughts tangled in a web of suspicion and danger. The more he pieced together the details, the clearer it became that the murder of the unknown man was no random act of violence. It was deliberate. But why? And who was behind it? As he returned to his small office, Daniel sat down at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, his brow furrowed. He needed a lead, something to connect the dots. And that's when Amir's name surfaced. Amir. The name was familiar to Daniel, though not in a way that offered comfort. Amir was a man of ambition, a local businessman whose rise to power had been marked by aggressive tactics and cutthroat decisions. He had a knack for making connections, forging deals with anyone who could further his interests. But that wasn't all. The rumors that surrounded Amir were darker than the gleaming smile he often flashed in public. Whispers of shady dealings, of underhanded exchanges with questionable figures, had followed him wherever he went. Some said he had ties with the criminal underworld, while others claimed he had crossed paths with dangerous men who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Daniel had heard the whispers, but he had never paid much attention. After all, Amir had his hands in nearly every facet of local business. He was a man of influence, and in the small, tight-knit village, that made him untouchable. But now, with the body discovered and the investigation underway, those rumors couldn't be ignored. Amir's name had been brought up in relation to the murder. Some believed that the victim was a rival of Amir's, while others suspected that Amir might have had a more personal involvement in the tragedy. It was the timing that worried Daniel the most. There had been tension in the village in recent weeks. Amir's dealings had grown more aggressive, his business ventures more ambitious. He had been pushing the boundaries, trying to acquire land and resources from locals who were hesitant to sell. His behavior had become erratic, and some of his closest allies had started to back away from him. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with Daniel. The murder, with its brutal and calculated nature, didn't seem like the result of a mere business rivalry. There was something more to it, a deeper, darker motive. Daniel needed answers. He needed to find Amir and question him about his involvement in the killing. But where to start? Amir's been laying low lately, murmured Sarah, the older woman who had been helping Daniel with the investigation. She had come to visit him at the office, her eyes shadowed with worry. I haven't seen him around the market like usual, and I heard from one of the vendors that he's been acting strange, nervous even. Nervous? Daniel asked, intrigued. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. How so? Sarah shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. Well, I heard that he's been meeting with some strangers, men who aren't from around here. And he's been very secretive about it. He keeps talking about things changing and how the world will be different soon. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about business anymore. Amir was involved in something bigger, something more dangerous. And now, it seemed as though those strange meetings were coming back to haunt him. There's more, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I overheard a conversation between Amir and one of his associates a few nights ago. They were talking about someone they needed to take care of. I couldn't make out all the details, but I'm sure it had something to do with the murder. Daniel's mind was racing. He needed to act quickly. He had to confront Amir before things escalated any further. The tension in the village was palpable, and Daniel could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The storm had already started, but the real storm, the one that would tear the village apart, was just beginning. I'll pay him a visit, Daniel said, determination in his voice. If Amir is behind this, we need to know. And if he's not, we need to find out who is. The sun had begun to set as Daniel made his way through the winding streets of the village. The rain had lessened, but the dampness in the air hung thick, making the world feel like a wet, suffocating blanket. He walked with purpose, his boots slapping against the muddy ground. He knew Amir's house well, an imposing structure at the edge of the village, far enough from the market to maintain a sense of privacy, but close enough to keep an eye on things. As he approached the house, Daniel noticed the dim light coming from the window. Someone was home. He knocked firmly on the door, his knuckles rapping loudly against the wood. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing Amir's face. The man who stood before him was not the confident, charming businessman that Daniel had encountered in the past. This Amir was different. His eyes were tired, his face drawn and pale. There was something almost frantic in his gaze. Daniel, Amir greeted him, his voice strained. What brings you here? I need to talk to you, Daniel said, his voice low but direct. About the murder. Amir's eyes flickered, but he quickly masked the emotion, forcing a smile. What murder? I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel took a step forward, his gaze hardening. Don't lie to me, Amir. The man was found in the village, head severed, dumped in the floodwaters. People are talking, and your name is coming up. You've been too busy making deals and meeting with strangers to not know something about it. Amir's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw the mask crack. It was enough for Daniel to know that something wasn't right. I don't know who he is, Daniel, Amir said, his voice defensive. I didn't do it. You have to believe me. But you know who's behind it, don't you? Daniel pressed. You know who was involved. You've been making enemies. This isn't just business anymore. This is something deeper, something dangerous. Amir's face turned ashen. He glanced around nervously before looking back at Daniel. I don't know who killed him, he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. But if you're right about this, you should stay away, Daniel. There's more going on here than you realize. The warning hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, but Daniel wasn't going to back down. Not now. Something dark was unfolding, and Amir was right at the center of it. Tell me what you know, Amir, Daniel said, his voice firm. It's the only way you're going to make it through this. For a long moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. The rain had started up again, and the storm was intensifying. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing inside Amir's house. The rain had started again, falling in sheets as Daniel walked back from Amir's house. His thoughts were clouded, and the weight of the conversation lingered in his mind. Amir's nervousness hadn't been lost on him. There was something more, something that the businessman wasn't revealing. And the way Amir had warned him to stay away, that was a red flag. It was clear now that the murder wasn't just a crime of passion or a simple business rivalry. It was something deeper, something darker. Daniel had been chasing shadows for too long, but now the shadows were beginning to form into something tangible. He had to dig deeper. Amir's connections, his history. There had to be something there, something that explained why this man was so terrified. But what could be so dangerous that even Amir, with all his power, would be afraid? It wasn't until the following day, when Daniel was speaking to one of the older villagers, that the truth started to come to light. Amir, the old man, Tomas, grunted as he spat out a mouthful of tobacco. He wasn't always the man he is now, you know. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Tomas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and glanced around, as if checking if anyone was listening. Years ago, Amir was part of a group that caused all kinds of trouble here. They were known as the Night Raiders. Nasty bunch. Never showed mercy to anyone. The Night Raiders? Daniel repeated, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean, cause trouble? What did they do? Tomas leaned in closer, lowering his voice. They burned homes, stole from the people, beat anyone who crossed them. The village was terrified. It was like living under the shadow of a storm. But Amir, he was one of their leaders. A manipulator, that one. He convinced people to join, made promises of riches and power. In the end, they all turned on him. When the raid stopped, Amir disappeared, went into hiding. But people never forgot what he did. Some still see him as a monster. The revelation hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Amir was more than just a businessman. He had a bloody past, a past that had never been fully dealt with. No wonder people were scared of him. No wonder they whispered his name behind closed doors. He wasn't just a man making shady deals. He was someone who had terrorized the village. And now, it seemed like his past was coming back to haunt him. But why hasn't anyone done anything? Daniel asked, his voice strained. Why hasn't he been held accountable for what he did? Tomas shook his head, his face grim. People tried. But Amir has a way of getting what he wants. He made sure no one could touch him. He had connections, powerful ones. And when the Night Raiders disbanded, he became a different man. He stayed low, kept quiet, built his fortune. He's been a ghost ever since. The more Daniel learned, the more he realized how deep Amir's entanglements ran. This wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. Amir wasn't just a man with enemies. He was a man who had earned every ounce of resentment the village had to offer. And now, it seemed that resentment had finally found a way to surface. That night, Daniel sat alone in his office, poring over every scrap of information he could gather. The pieces were falling into place, but something still didn't sit right. Why had Amir's past remained hidden for so long? Why hadn't anyone spoken out sooner? And what was the connection between the murder and the old gang? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Come in, Daniel called out. The door creaked open, and Sarah stepped in. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. She looked as though she had seen something that had shaken her to the core. Daniel, you need to hear this, she said, her voice trembling. He stood up, concerned. What is it? Someone just came to me. They said they saw Amir with a man yesterday, just before the murder. They were arguing. And the man, he was one of the Night Raiders. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A Night Raider? Are you sure? Sarah nodded. I'm not sure of the man's name, but he's tall with a scar across his cheek. People say he's one of the original members of the gang. They were seen near the docks. After that, the man disappeared, and Amir, he seemed different. More agitated. Daniel's mind was racing. The pieces were starting to click together. Amir's past wasn't just a distant memory. It was very much alive, and it had come back to haunt him. But the bigger question loomed. What had Amir done to provoke this return? And why had the Night Raiders come back into the picture? I need to find this man, Daniel said, determination in his voice. If he's one of the Night Raiders, then he might know something about the murder, and about Amir's role in it. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. Be careful, Daniel. You're dealing with dangerous people. The Night Raiders. There's no telling how far they'll go. Daniel nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But he knew he had no choice. He had to uncover the truth. The village had been living in fear for too long, and the longer Amir's past remained a secret, the more the threat would grow. Later that evening, Daniel set out to track down the mysterious man. He knew where the night raiders had once been active, the old part of town, the crumbling buildings and shadowed alleys where the gang had made their mark. It was the last place anyone would go willingly, but it was where the answers lay. As he moved deeper into the area, Daniel felt the tension in the air, thick with the weight of history. The streets were empty, but he could feel eyes on him, lurking in the shadows. He rounded a corner and froze. There in the dim light stood the man Sarah had described, the tall figure with the scar across his cheek. He was leaning against the wall, smoking a cigarette, as if he had been waiting for Daniel all along. Looking for something, the man asked, his voice low and raspy. Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm looking for the truth." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a long drag from his cigarette before flicking it away. "You're digging in places you shouldn't, Daniel. You don't want to know what's buried there." But Daniel wasn't afraid anymore. He had already come too far to turn back. "You're part of the night raiders, aren't you? What do you know about Amir? What's he hiding?" The man's face twitched, and for a moment, it seemed like he would walk away. But then he spoke, his voice dripping with disdain. "Amir's got blood on his hands," he muttered. "But he's not the one you should be worried about. There's someone else, the real mastermind. And they've been pulling the strings from the shadows. Amir, he's just a pawn in all this." Daniel's heart raced. "Who is it? Who's behind all of this?" The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You'll find out soon enough. But don't say I didn't warn you. The past has a way of catching up with everyone." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Daniel standing in the silence, his mind racing with the new revelation. The past had come alive, and now it was more dangerous than ever. The night had fallen heavy over the village, the wind howling through the trees, sending whispers of unease through the narrow streets. As the days passed after Amir's death, something strange began to stir in the air. It was subtle at first, an inexplicable chill that seemed to settle over the village at dusk, and the eerie feeling that something was watching. It wasn't until the 6th night after the discovery of Amir's body that the rumors started to spread like wildfire. "I heard footsteps outside my house last night," Marla whispered as she leaned in close to Daniel, her eyes darting nervously around the empty room. "No one was there when I checked. And the dogs," Tomas added, his voice strained. "They wouldn't stop howling. 4 hours. They were all at the village edge, growling at nothing. It's the spirits, Daniel. They're angry." Daniel furrowed his brow. He had heard the stories. Everyone in the village knew the legends, how the spirits of the land, the ancestors, would take vengeance on anyone who violated the sacred rules. But he had always dismissed them as old wives' tales, superstition. Now, though, there was a subtle tension in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "I don't know about curses, Tomas," Daniel said, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "We're dealing with a crime here, not some old superstition. Amir had enemies. There's nothing mystical about that." Marla's eyes flashed with a mix of fear and belief. But Amir wasn't just any man. He angered the wrong people, Daniel. He wronged the spirits. We all saw the way he treated the villagers. He thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. He didn't know the stories, the old ways. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. It was becoming harder to ignore the strange occurrences. People were saying the village was cursed. They spoke of a time, long ago, when another man, just like Amir, had been marked by the spirits after he wronged the land. That man had met a similar fate, found dead, his body desecrated, and no one could explain it. Some believed it was punishment from the gods, others claimed it was the land itself seeking balance. But was it possible? Was Amir's death part of something larger than just a feud between men? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside his window, rattling the shutters, and the sound of the storm seemed to echo through the walls of his house. He tried to focus on the facts, the motives, the connections, the people who might have wanted Amir dead. But the more he thought about the villagers' whispers, the more his mind wandered back to the strange events that had followed Amir's death. The following morning, as Daniel walked through the market square, he noticed that more and more villagers were avoiding eye contact, hastily going about their business. Some muttered prayers as they passed, others glanced nervously over their shoulders. Something was off. Daniel, a familiar voice, called from behind him. It was Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You've got to see this." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the edge of the village, near the forest. When they reached the small clearing, Daniel's eyes fell upon something that made his blood run cold. There, in the dirt, was a symbol, an intricate pattern drawn with what looked like ash. It was strange, unfamiliar, and it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air around it felt charged, as though something ancient had been disturbed. "What is this?" Daniel whispered, kneeling down to examine the symbol. "I found it this morning," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "Some of the older women say it's an old sigil, something tied to the spirits of the land. They say it's a warning. It's the sign of the curse." Daniel's mind raced. He'd heard about these old symbols, of course, tales told in hushed voices around campfires, but he'd never believed them. Until now, the thought that Amir's death could be connected to something beyond mere human rivalry unsettled him. "There's no way this is coincidence," Daniel muttered. "The timing, the rumors, it all fits. But it doesn't make sense. Why would the spirits care about Amir?" Sarah's face hardened, and she stepped back. "It's not just about Amir, Daniel. He wronged the village in ways we can't even understand. He took from us, destroyed lives. The spirits didn't forget." "Then why did they wait so long?" Daniel asked, more to himself than to Sarah. "Why now? Why Amir?" The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and for a moment, Daniel thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. His breath caught in his throat, but when he blinked, the figure was gone, vanished like a mirage. "We can't ignore this anymore," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "People are already talking. If we don't do something, more strange things will happen. Worse things. I've heard stories from the older generation about what happens when the spirits are angered." Daniel stood up slowly, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The investigation had taken a strange turn. What had started as a typical murder case had turned into something far more complex and dangerous. The villagers had always feared the wrath of the spirits, and now it seemed their worst fears were coming to life. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the notes he had gathered over the past few days. The more he looked at the facts, the business deals gone wrong, the personal grudges, the more it seemed like there was something he was missing. The murder didn't fit the pattern of a normal crime. The symbols, the strange occurrences, it all pointed to something far more ancient, far more dangerous. He looked out the window, his thoughts heavy. Had Amir's past really come back to haunt him? Had the spirits of the land judged him? Or was there someone else involved, someone using the supernatural as a cover for their own deadly actions? The sound of knocking at the door interrupted his thoughts. Daniel rose, moving to answer it. When he opened the door, he found a stranger standing there, cloaked in a dark robe, their face hidden beneath a hood. "I've come to warn you," the stranger said in a low voice. "You're on the wrong path. The spirits will not forgive you for meddling in what is not meant to be disturbed." The air seemed to grow colder. Daniel felt the weight of the stranger's words settle on his chest like a stone. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the chill running through him. The figure stepped forward, their voice barely a whisper. "The curse has already begun. Amir's death is just the beginning. The spirits have been awakened. You cannot stop what is coming." With that, The stranger turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Daniel standing there, his heart racing. He had been warned, but the question remained. Was the curse real, or was someone using it as a weapon to cover their tracks? As the rain began to fall again, Daniel realized the answer would come soon enough. But whether it would bring clarity, or even survival, was still uncertain. The village was eerily silent as Sarah stood over the lifeless body of her son, her fingers gently tracing the outline of his cold face. The once vibrant eyes that had sparkled with ambition and energy were now dull, closed forever. Her heart shattered as the truth of Amir's death sank in. He was gone, ripped from her life in a brutal, senseless way. The rain that had fallen relentlessly for days now seemed to match the torrential storm raging in her heart. She had always known Amir's past had haunted him, that his ambition had often led him down dark paths, but she had never imagined it would lead to his violent death. "Amir, my son," Sarah whispered through her tears, her voice breaking. She hadn't cried like this in years. For so long, she had held on to the hope that he could change, that the boy she once knew, full of hope and innocence, would return. But in the end, she had failed to protect him. The weight of that failure crushed her. Her son had been so full of life, so full of promise. And now, she was left with nothing but his cold, lifeless body, a silent reminder of everything she had lost. The villagers had gathered at a distance, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and curiosity, whispering behind their hands. Sarah could hear snippets of their conversations, talk of Amir's dangerous dealings, the rumors of betrayal, the mystery surrounding his murder. But she couldn't focus on any of that. All she could focus on was the emptiness she felt in her chest, the deafening silence that had taken over her world. But then something stirred inside her, something beyond grief. It was a sharp, searing realization that her son's death couldn't be left in the shadows. The village's whispers, the questions about betrayal, the talk of curse, it all pointed to one thing. There was a truth to uncover. Amir's death wasn't just a random act of violence. It was deliberate, calculated, and it needed to be answered for. "Amir," Sarah whispered again, this time with more resolve. "I will find out who did this to you." Her grief began to harden into a burning determination. No longer would she allow herself to drown in sorrow. If she wanted to honor her son's memory, if she wanted to find peace, she had to act. And that meant uncovering the truth. It wasn't long before Sarah approached Daniel, the local investigator who had been working tirelessly to solve the mystery of Amir's murder. She found him standing near the village square, his face grim, his brow furrowed in thought. "Daniel," she called, her voice steady despite the torrent of emotions inside her. "I need your help." Daniel turned to face her, his expression softening when he saw the tears in her eyes. "Sarah," he said gently, "I know this is hard, but I'm doing everything I can to find out who did this to Amir." "I know you are," she said, her voice breaking for just a moment before she regained her composure. "But I need to help you. I can't just sit here and wait for answers. I need to know the truth. I need to know who did this to my son." Daniel studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her tear-streaked face. He could see the depth of her grief, but also the strength that had begun to take root in her. He knew how hard it must be for her to ask for his help. She was a mother, and mothers didn't want to think about the darkest parts of their children's lives. But Sarah had seen the signs. She understood now that Amir's past couldn't be ignored. "I'll help you," Daniel said finally, his voice firm. "But this won't be easy. There are forces at play here that go beyond just business rivalries and petty feuds. Amir's death is more than just a crime. It's something deeper, something darker." "I don't care what it takes," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the pain. "I need to know who killed him. If not for me, then for Amir's sake. He didn't deserve to die like this." Daniel nodded, his expression hardening. "All right. We'll do this together. But you need to prepare yourself, Sarah. This investigation may uncover things you're not ready to hear." "I'm ready," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I need to know everything." With that, they set out together, determined to uncover the truth behind Amir's murder. Daniel had already begun to piece together the fragments of Amir's life, the shady business deals, the enemies he had made, and the old grudges that had resurfaced in the wake of his death. But now, with Sarah's determination fueling his own, Daniel found a renewed sense of urgency. The days that followed were a blur of conversations, interviews, and searching for clues. Daniel and Sarah went through Amir's personal belongings, hoping to find something, anything, that could lead them to the killer. There were no easy answers. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the web of connections became. One afternoon, after hours of combing through old records and speaking with Amir's associates, they finally uncovered a piece of evidence that sent a chill through their bones. A letter hidden among Amir's things, addressed to a mysterious figure in the village. The contents were cryptic, but it was clear that Amir had been involved in something dangerous, something far beyond the local business community. "I knew it," Daniel muttered as he read the letter aloud. Amir had made enemies, not just from his business dealings, but from his past. He was involved in something much darker than we realized. Sarah's face tightened as she listened to the words on the page. The letter spoke of old debts, of promises made and broken, of forces that no one dared to cross. Amir had owed someone something, and that debt had come due in the most brutal way. This is bigger than I thought," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with both fear and determination. "I should have known. Amir's past wasn't something he could outrun. But I didn't think it would catch up to him like this." "None of us did," Daniel said quietly. "But now we have to find out who's behind this. We have to make sure Amir didn't die in vain." Sarah's heart ached with the weight of the discovery, but a new fire burned within her. Her grief had not gone away, it never would. But now it was fueling her need for justice. Her son had been taken from her, but she would not rest until she found the answers. "I won't stop until I know the truth," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "For Amir, for us all." And with that, Sarah and Daniel began their search anew, more determined than ever to uncover the darkness that had claimed Amir's life, no matter where it led them. The days blurred together as Daniel dug deeper into the mystery of Amir's death. He had thought that uncovering the motive behind one man's murder would be difficult enough, but what he was finding now went beyond anything he could have imagined. The village, once a place of calm and simplicity, was slowly revealing itself to be a labyrinth of lies, hidden alliances, and dark secrets that had long festered beneath the surface. It all started with a quiet conversation he overheard in the market one morning. Two villagers, Thomas and Esther, were speaking in hushed tones, their words barely audible above the noise of the bustling crowd. But Daniel's sharp ears caught a few key phrases. "He knew too much," Thomas muttered, his voice tinged with fear. "We can't let this get out." Esther's response was equally ominous. "It's already too late. Once he started asking questions, there's no turning back now." Daniel's heart raced as he slipped further into the shadows, careful not to draw attention to himself. What had Amir known? Who were they talking about? And what exactly was happening in this seemingly quiet village? These questions rattled around in his mind like a storm, urging him to dig deeper. The next day, he visited the tavern where Amir had frequented before his death. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale ale, and the low murmur of voices filled the room. Behind the bar, the innkeeper, Michael, was cleaning a glass. Daniel approached him, his mind focused on the task at hand. "I need to ask you about Amir," he said, his tone casual but firm. Michael paused, wiping the glass absent-mindedly. "What about him?" he asked, not meeting Daniel's gaze. There was a nervousness in his voice that Daniel didn't miss. "He had been here often," Daniel pressed. "Did he ever talk about anyone? Anyone who might have been after him?" Michael's face hardened slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel. Amir was a regular, like anyone else. He kept to himself." You should ask the others." But something in Michael's tone sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The man was hiding something. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the innkeeper knew more than he was letting on. "I will," Daniel replied, his voice low. "But if you know something, Michael, now would be the time to speak." Michael's eyes flickered toward the door as if considering something. Then, after a long pause, he leaned in closer. "You should be careful, Daniel," he whispered. "This village isn't what it seems. You're digging up things that should stay buried." Amir wasn't just involved in business deals, he was tangled up in something much darker. And now people are starting to talk. Daniel's curiosity piqued, but Michael quickly withdrew, returning to his work as though the conversation had never happened. There was no more time to press the man. The air was thick with tension, and Daniel knew he would need to find other ways to uncover the truth. As he continued to piece together the fragments of Amir's life, Daniel discovered something that shocked him to his core. The village, once thought to be a simple farming community, had a history of secrecy and hidden alliances. Years ago, a series of violent conflicts had swept through the area, leaving deep scars. And although the villagers had long since moved on, the damage had not been forgotten. The alliances formed during those troubled times still lingered, like shadows, influencing the village's current affairs. One night, Daniel visited the village elder, an old woman named Magda, who had lived in the area for decades. She was known for her sharp mind and extensive knowledge of the village's history. He sat down across from her in her modest cottage, the fire crackling in the hearth as the two exchanged pleasantries. After some small talk, Daniel got to the point. "Magda," he began, his voice steady, "I need to know about the past. About the alliances, the ones formed during the conflicts. What happened? Who was involved?" Magda's eyes grew dark, and she lowered her voice as if the very walls might be listening. "There are things, Daniel, things that should never be spoken of. The village has changed, yes, but the people, the ones who lived through those times, they still carry the weight of what happened. Amir's death, it wasn't just his past catching up with him. It's much deeper than that." Daniel leaned forward, sensing that she was about to reveal something crucial. "What are you saying, Magda? Was Amir a part of something bigger?" Magda hesitated, her old eyes searching his face for signs of understanding. "Amir wasn't just a businessman, no. He was involved with the wrong people, people who had their own motives, their own hidden agendas. The villagers who have ties to those people, they're not who they seem to be. Amir's death was a consequence of a much bigger game, one that has been playing out in the shadows for years." Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Magda's tone shifted, as though she had been caught in the middle of a forbidden conversation. "You'll learn more, Daniel," she said cryptically. "But be careful. Trust no one. There are eyes everywhere." With that, she fell silent, and Daniel understood that she had said all she was willing to say for now. He stood up, grateful for the insight, but troubled by the new revelations. The village wasn't just hiding one man's secrets. It was concealing a long history of deceit, manipulation, and hidden alliances that had shaped everything. The next day, as Daniel continued his investigation, he found himself questioning everyone. The seemingly friendly shopkeeper, the quiet farmer, the kind-hearted healer, they all had something to hide. The deeper he went, the more tangled the web became. And each new lead seemed to point back to a single undeniable truth. Amir's death wasn't just about one man. It was a message to all of them. Daniel stood at the village's edge one evening, looking out over the land that had once seemed so peaceful. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of secrets, and Daniel knew he couldn't stop until he uncovered it all. He had come to realize that Amir's death was only the tip of the iceberg. The village's dark secrets ran much deeper than anyone could have imagined, and it was up to him to expose them before they claimed anyone else. The morning fog clung to the village like a shroud, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. Daniel stood at the edge of the village square, his mind racing with the threads of the investigation that seemed to twist further into darkness with each passing day. He had uncovered so much, yet there were still so many pieces of the puzzle left to find. The villagers were tight-lipped, their suspicions growing as his questions stirred up old wounds. Just as Daniel was about to meet with Sarah to discuss the latest developments in Amir's case, a commotion broke out at the village's entrance. Daniel turned toward the noise and saw a man standing at the gate, his silhouette barely visible through the mist. His posture was stiff, as though he were trying to regain his bearings after a long absence. "Who's that?" Daniel murmured under his breath, instinctively stepping toward the commotion. One of the villagers, a woman named Eva, hurried past him, shaking her head. "That's Adam. He's come back after all these years." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Adam. The name sent a chill down his spine. Adam was more than just a name. He was a shadow from the past. Daniel had heard whispers of him during his investigation. He was a figure that many in the village spoke of in hushed tones, but no one dared to mention directly. Adam had been part of the very group that had torn the village apart years ago, a group of rebels who had caused chaos and bloodshed before disappearing into the wilderness, only to be forgotten until now. As Adam approached, his weathered face came into view. His dark eyes scanned the village with a mixture of wariness and something darker, something that suggested he knew exactly what had been happening. He wasn't here just for a reunion with old friends. Daniel could sense it immediately. Adam was here for answers. He had a purpose, and it was likely tied to Amir's death. "Adam," Eva called, rushing toward him. "It's good to see you, but what brings you back after all this time?" Adam's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've heard about Amir," he said, his voice rough from years of disuse. "And I've come to find out who's responsible for his death." Daniel stepped forward, his gaze locked on Adam. There was no mistaking it. This was a man who had lived through the storm of the village's darkest days. A man who had secrets buried deep within him. And now, as if by fate, he had returned, just when Daniel was beginning to uncover some of those secrets. "You're looking for answers too, then?" Daniel asked, his tone cautious. Adam nodded, his expression hardening. "I never wanted Amir dead. But there's something more at play here. Something I've been avoiding for years." "Unfinished business?" Daniel asked, sensing that Adam's return wasn't just about Amir's murder. Adam's eyes narrowed. "You could say that. But there are things I'm not ready to talk about yet." Daniel didn't push further, though his curiosity gnawed at him. The air between them thickened with unspoken words. Adam's return was no coincidence. Something had drawn him back to the village. The question was, what? "We should talk," Daniel said after a long pause. "There are things you need to know about Amir. Things you might not be aware of." Adam's gaze softened for a moment. "I know he was involved in business dealings," he said, his voice quieter. "But I also know Amir better than most. He was never a saint, but he didn't deserve to die like this." Daniel nodded, his mind racing with questions. He motioned for Adam to follow him to a quieter spot, away from the prying eyes of the villagers. As they walked, Daniel couldn't help but wonder about the connection between Adam's return and Amir's murder. The village had always been a place of buried secrets, but now, with Adam back in the picture, those secrets felt like they were about to explode to the surface. Once they were alone, Daniel turned to Adam. "You were part of the group that caused trouble in the past, weren't you? The one that everyone talks about in whispers." Adam's face darkened, and he looked away for a moment, as though the weight of the past was too much to bear. "I didn't cause it all," he muttered, his voice low and pained. "But I was there. I didn't want to, but sometimes you don't have a choice." Daniel studied Adam closely. There was more to this story than Adam was letting on, but Daniel could feel it in the tension in the air. This wasn't just about Amir's murder. This was about a reckoning, one that had been years in the making. "Do you think Amir's death has something to do with that past?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the swirl of thoughts in his head. "Do you think someone's tying the present to the sins of the past?" Adam's eyes darkened. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough. But I do know this. The people who were involved in those events haven't forgotten. They're still here in this village, hiding in plain sight. And if you think Amir's death is the end of it, you're wrong. It's just the beginning. The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Adam's return wasn't just a coincidence. It was a harbinger of something darker, something that was coming to a head after years of silence. As Adam continued to speak, Daniel's mind raced. He had learned so much about Amir's life, but this new twist, this connection to the village's violent past, added a whole new layer of complexity. It seemed that Amir's death wasn't a random act of violence, but a deliberate part of a larger plan, one that Daniel had only just begun to unravel. We need to find out who's behind this, Daniel said, his voice firm. But be careful, Adam. People here aren't what they seem. If you have enemies from your past, they could be hiding in the shadows. Adam's gaze grew resolute. I know, he said quietly. I'm ready for whatever comes next. As the two men prepared to face the truth, the tension in the village grew palpable. The storm that had been brewing for years was finally breaking, and the past was about to collide with the present in a way no one could predict. Daniel and Adam both knew that the answers they sought would come at a cost, but they were prepared to pay whatever price was necessary to uncover the truth and bring justice to the man who had been lost to the shadows of the village's dark history. The days had passed, each one heavier than the last. Daniel and Adam had gathered what little information they could, piecing together fragments of gossip and whispers. But despite their efforts, the truth had eluded them, cloaked in layers of deception and half-truths. The village, once so familiar, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, and with each step, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Adam had become increasingly agitated. The return to the village had reopened old wounds, and his dark eyes reflected a man at war with his past. He was no stranger to conflict, but the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about Amir's murder anymore. It was about something far deeper, something buried under years of bitterness and resentment. Daniel, Adam said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. We're running out of time. People are starting to whisper. I can feel it. Someone's watching us. Daniel nodded, his own unease growing with each passing hour. He had known from the beginning that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy, but now the danger was real. It wasn't just a murder they were investigating. It was a war for control, a battle between the past and the present. And the longer they delayed, the more perilous their situation became. I know, Daniel replied, but we need to confront the one who knows more. There's one person in this village who has the answers. Someone who can break this wide open. It's time. The two men stood outside a weathered house at the edge of the village, an old, decaying structure that had seen better days. The house belonged to Elias, a man whose name had come up again and again in their investigation. Whispers about him were filled with venom and distrust. Elias had been a close friend of Amir once, back when they were both young and the world still seemed full of hope. But time had turned them against each other, and now Elias was more of a ghost than a man. Are you ready for this? Daniel asked quietly, his hand resting on the doorframe. Adam's jaw clenched. I have no choice, do I? No, Daniel said firmly. None of us do. The two men entered without knocking. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the silence was oppressive. It was clear that Elias had been living alone for some time, his once vibrant life now reduced to the shadows of the past. Elias was sitting in the corner of the room when they entered. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, as though the weight of his own guilt had hollowed him out. He looked up at them with a mix of recognition and caution. There was no surprise in his eyes. He had been expecting them. You're here, Elias rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I knew you would be. It's all come to this, hasn't it? Daniel stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the older man. You know why we're here. It's time to tell us the truth, Elias. No more hiding. Elias let out a bitter laugh, his eyes glistening with something dangerous. The truth? The truth doesn't matter anymore, Daniel. It never did. Not in this place. You think you can just walk in here and demand answers? You think you can undo everything that's been done? Adam's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching at his side. What happened between you and Amir, Elias? You were once friends, weren't you? What changed? Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the two of them, his expression shifting between anger and resignation. Finally, he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. Amir was always too ambitious, too reckless. He thought he could run this village, control it, bend it to his will. But in the end, he crossed the wrong people. He betrayed me, betrayed all of us. And when I saw him crawling back into the village after everything he'd done, I knew I couldn't just let it go. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Betrayed you? What are you talking about? Elias's eyes darkened. Amir didn't just cross a business partner. He crossed the whole village. He led a group of us into something we shouldn't have done. There were people here who trusted him, and he threw them away like they meant nothing. Adam clenched his fists. You killed him because of a betrayal? You think that's justice? Elias's gaze was hard now, almost dead. What do you think justice is, Adam? Amir's betrayal wasn't just about money or business. It was about lives. He didn't just walk away from the mess he made. He left behind a trail of broken promises and broken people. He was a cancer to this village. I had to cut him out. The air grew thick with tension as the words hung in the room. Daniel felt the weight of the revelation sink in. This wasn't just a murder. It was the culmination of years of festering resentment, of grudges that had never healed. Elias hadn't just killed Amir because of a personal vendetta. He had killed him because Amir had been a symbol of all the wrongs in the village, and Elias had seen his death as a necessary act of cleansing. But you didn't have to kill him, Daniel said quietly, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You didn't have to go this far. Elias stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. I did what needed to be done. The truth, Daniel, is that we were all betrayed, and I'm not the only one who felt it. There are more of us in this village. More who will make sure that the past never repeats itself. And if it takes another death to keep that from happening, so be it. The coldness in Elias's voice sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. The man wasn't just a murderer. He was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in this village. And yet, there was something deeper at play, a cycle of violence and revenge that had been set in motion long before Amir's death. Adam's fists were clenched tightly now, his entire body tense with rage. You've destroyed everything. You think this ends with Amir? You think you've fixed anything by spilling blood? Elias didn't flinch. The blood's already been spilled, Adam. And there's more to come, if that's what it takes. With those words, the truth of it all hit Daniel with the force of a freight train. Amir's death wasn't just the result of a single betrayal. It was the product of a festering wound that had been left to rot for years. The village's dark past, its secrets, its lies, all of it had led to this. And now, with the truth laid bare, there was no turning back. The confrontation had done more than expose the murderer. It had opened a door to a new kind of reckoning. And for better or worse, Daniel knew that the village would never be the same. The heavy fog settled over the village like a shroud, thickening the air and making the paths almost invisible. The storm had passed, but the eerie calm that followed felt unnatural, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Daniel had always been skeptical of the superstitions that ran deep in the veins of this village, but as he trudged through the damp streets, he couldn't help but sense that something was wrong, something beyond the physical realm. A few days had passed since Elias's confession, but the air in the village remained thick with tension. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the villagers, especially the older ones, began to speak of things Daniel had never taken seriously before: ghosts, spirits, and curses. They claimed Amir's death had angered the very spirits of the village, stirring an ancient malevolence that had been dormant for generations. As Daniel made his way toward the old well in the center of the village, he noticed something strange. The usually bustling market square was empty. No children played, no traders called out their wares, and the usual hum of life had been replaced by an unnatural silence. A few villagers who lingered on the edge of the square looked at him with wide eyes, their faces pale as if they'd seen a ghost. He stopped one of them, a man named Rafik, who was huddled in the shadow of a nearby building. "Rafik, what's going on? Where is everyone?" Daniel asked, his voice steady, though he couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. Rafik's gaze darted nervously around before he leaned in closer. "You haven't heard, then?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's happening. The spirit of Amir is restless. His soul hasn't been at peace since that night. People say his ghost haunts the village now. They say he's seeking revenge for the way he was killed." Daniel scoffed, brushing off Rafik's words. "Come on, Rafik. This isn't a ghost story. Amir was murdered, plain and simple. Nothing more to it." Rafik's face was pale, and his hands shook as he clasped them together. "I wish it was that simple. But strange things have been happening, Daniel. People hear footsteps in the night, whispers in the wind. Last night, the lights in my house flickered like someone was moving through the rooms, and when I looked, no one was there. My daughter saw a shadow by the window, an outline of a man, but when she looked again, it was gone." Daniel felt a chill creep down his spine, but he refused to acknowledge the fear growing within him. He had heard similar tales all his life, stories about curses and vengeful spirits, but he had always dismissed them as the ramblings of the old and the superstitious. Still, as Rafik spoke, Daniel couldn't help but feel a strange weight in the air, something oppressive and heavy that made his chest tighten. "I don't believe in curses, Rafik," Daniel said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "Then why is the village so quiet?" Rafik asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are the animals acting strange? The dogs refuse to bark, the birds aren't singing. And last night, the old woman who lives near the edge of the forest said she saw a figure in the trees, something tall, dark, and unnaturally still." Daniel frowned. "What figure?" Rafik's eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know, but she says it looked like Amir, or at least it looked like his shadow. She said it was standing there, watching the village." "Impossible," Daniel muttered under his breath. He felt his skepticism crack just a little, but he pushed it aside. There had to be a rational explanation for all of this. Still, the oddities continued. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel found himself drawn to the outskirts of the village, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. It was there in the distance that he saw the flicker of a shadow, tall and thin, standing motionless beneath a massive oak tree. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His instincts screamed for him to turn back, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure remained still, but something about it felt wrong. It didn't move, even when a gust of wind rustled through the leaves. And as Daniel took a cautious step forward, the shadow seemed to grow darker, more defined. He could swear he saw the outline of a man, though his features remained shrouded in the dim light. "Amir?" Daniel whispered, though his voice felt hollow in the vast emptiness of the village. No response came, only the slow creak of the trees swaying in the wind. But then, just as Daniel was about to take another step, the shadow seemed to vanish, slipping away into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. Shaking his head, Daniel backed away. He couldn't explain what he'd seen. It could have been a trick of the light, a trick of his mind playing on his nerves. He had to focus. He had to stay grounded. But the village was no longer the place it once was. The familiar had turned strange, the comforting sounds of daily life replaced by a constant sense of unease. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact, their every movement tinged with paranoia. The older generation, those who remembered the old stories, were the loudest in their fears, warning the younger ones to stay inside before nightfall, to avoid wandering the streets alone. "Don't you feel it?" Rafik had said one evening, his voice shaking with dread. "The air is thick with it. I swear, the spirit of Amir is walking among us. He's waiting for the right moment to strike." Daniel tried to shake it off. He tried to remind himself that he was a man of reason, not superstition. But every passing hour, every flicker of movement in the corner of his vision, chipped away at his certainty. The village was changing, the atmosphere growing darker, and in the pit of his stomach, he felt a gnawing sense of fear that refused to be ignored. Then, one morning, just as the sun barely kissed the horizon, the body of a young woman was found near the old well, the same place where Amir had been found. Her body was mangled, bruised, and the villagers were once again thrown into a frenzy. The whispers began again. Amir's spirit had claimed another victim. "Enough!" Daniel shouted to the crowd gathered around the well. "This is not the work of a spirit. This is murder, plain and simple." But deep inside, even Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker than human hands was at play. Was it possible? Was Amir's death truly the beginning of a curse that had been set into motion years ago? A curse that was now seeking retribution? And if so, was anyone safe? The weight of the investigation had been bearing down on Daniel for weeks, each new revelation only darkening the path ahead. He had followed leads through the village's shadowy corners, where secrets festered and truths were buried beneath layers of lies. The villagers, once familiar faces, had become suspicious, their gazes following him wherever he went. Daniel knew the truth was close, but he wasn't prepared for what he would uncover in the final moments of this twisted journey. It was late one evening when Daniel found himself in the village's old tavern, a place where time seemed to have stood still. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the air was thick with the smell of stale ale and forgotten memories. He had arranged to meet Adam, who had become an unlikely ally in the investigation. Adam's presence had sparked something in Daniel. He wasn't just an outsider returning to his roots. He was a key to unraveling the complex web of deceit that had enveloped Amir's death. As Daniel entered the tavern, he found Adam sitting at a corner table, his face gaunt and his eyes sharp with the same urgency that Daniel had been feeling for days. "Any progress?" Adam asked, his voice low, eyes scanning the room nervously. Daniel sat down, the weight of the truth pressing heavily on his chest. "I've uncovered something big, Adam. This isn't just about Amir's death. It's a lot bigger than that. The whole village has been hiding a secret, and it goes all the way to the top." Adam leaned forward, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Daniel paused, gathering his thoughts, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "It's a conspiracy, Adam. A group of powerful people in the village, some of them the wealthiest and most influential, have been pulling the strings behind the scenes for years. They've been manipulating everything, business deals, land acquisitions, even the local government. Amir was a threat to them, a loose end that had to be tied up." Adam's face twisted in disbelief. "But why Amir? He wasn't involved in their politics, not like they were." Daniel nodded grimly. "No, but Amir knew things. He knew about their dealings. He had started digging into their financials, uncovering evidence of corruption and embezzlement. And when he got too close to the truth, they decided he had to be silenced." The tavern grew quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Daniel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Amir didn't just die because of old grudges. He was murdered to protect a much larger scheme. He was taken out because he posed a threat to their power." Adam's eyes widened, his expression shifting from disbelief to understanding. "So it was all about money, power, and control. They killed him to protect their empire." Daniel nodded again, feeling the weight of the truth settle around them like a suffocating fog. "It's more than that, though. The conspiracy involves some of the people I never expected, people I thought I could trust. the mayor, some of the wealthiest landowners, even people I grew up with. The room seemed to close in around them, and Daniel felt a chill creep up his spine. The truth was out, but the cost of uncovering it was far greater than he had imagined. Who were they? Adam asked, his voice tight with anger. I'm still piecing it together, but it doesn't matter now. The damage has been done, Daniel said, his voice heavy with resignation. These people have too much power. They've been covering their tracks for years, and now that the truth is out, there's no going back. A silence fell over the table, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside the tavern's cracked windows. Daniel stared into his drink, the dark liquid swirling in his glass, as if it could somehow wash away the heaviness that had settled in his chest. And what now? Adam asked, breaking the silence. Daniel's eyes met his expression hardening. Now we expose them. We bring everything to light. But it won't be easy. There's too much at stake, and there are people who will stop at nothing to protect themselves. Adam nodded slowly, his face a mask of determination. We do what we have to do, but we can't do it alone. Daniel's mind raced. The weight of the village's corruption, its secrets, and the lives it had destroyed hung heavy in the air between them. There was no turning back now. As much as he wanted to walk away, as much as he longed to escape the nightmare, he couldn't. The truth had to come out. Suddenly, the door to the tavern swung open, and a figure stepped inside, cloaked in shadow. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood on end. The person moved with purpose, their presence commanding attention. Without a word, they walked directly toward their table. Daniel, Adam, the figure said in a low, gravelly voice. I think you've uncovered too much. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The figure before him was none other than the village's mayor, Elias, the very man who had been at the center of the web of deceit. He stood there, an aura of authority surrounding him, but there was something cold and calculating in his eyes. We've known about your little investigation, Elias continued, his lips curling into a sinister smile. You've stirred up old ghosts, Daniel. And now, it's time to put them to rest. Before Daniel could respond, the tavern door slammed shut behind Elias. The village had been shaken to its core, but in that moment, Daniel realized the truth. Exposing the conspiracy had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and the village would never be the same again. The revelation was complete. The murder of Amir was not just a tragedy. It was the final piece in a puzzle of greed, betrayal, and power. And now, Daniel had no choice but to face the consequences of uncovering the truth. The village was forever changed, and the cost of this revelation would be paid in ways no one could foresee. Drop a like if you enjoyed this, and share it with your friends to help us grow.